I guess this is what they call the official welcome, so, welcome.
Hey, how you doing?
We've got a couple things I wanted to thank real quick, if you don't mind, before Martin gets ready here. Working as a committee is very difficult, and I wanted to thank the three guys that I work with for putting up with me. For those of you who don't know, sometimes that can be just a tad difficult to get along with. But they react very well, so I appreciate that. And I want to thank my family. As you've noticed, it's a family affair for us. We even brought a dog this year, so. And Michael Nino, I don't know if he's in here or not, but I wanted to thank him because he blankets Columbus with flyers for me. He goes to all the stores, the ones that I chose not to go to. And he's made the map out for the restaurants in the area right here, so. Thanks to Michael. I'm sure there's other people I should thank too, but Martin is one of them. He's been working like a trooper all weekend, bringing his equipment and everything else. Thanks, Martin. The con suite, I don't know if any of you have been over there or not. Last night was sponsored by Pulpfest. Tonight is being sponsored by the Meteor House, which is part of FarmerCon. Mike Croteau and Win Eckert have provided all the snacks and drinks over there tonight. Tomorrow night, the Robert E. Howard Foundation will be sponsoring the con event, con suite. So, want to make sure if you see those guys, give them a thank you and tell them that you appreciate what we've done. Yes, sir. It's open right now, right across the hall. Yeah.
Where's the restaurant?
Tomorrow night's a business meeting. We can discuss anything you might want to discuss at that time. I know one of the things I want to discuss is the air conditioning, or lack of, and anything else that you might want to bring up, be thinking about between now and then, and we'll hash it out tomorrow. Is everybody semi-satisfied so far, or, are there any major complaints that Terry can address? All right, that's the official welcome. That's long enough. Martin, you about ready? Okay, well, I'll talk for a while. We've got a very nice evening of programming that we've worked very hard to work out for you. Hope you enjoy most of it or all of it. Did you hear the one about? Oh, no, that's not. You ready? Yes, I did. The bad thing about the hotel is the facilities like this, but the good thing is the response from some of these guys that work here. The guys down at the lower level do a heck of a job, and I've told them we appreciate it. So I've said about all I can say, Martin. It's hot up here.
In the hall.
Yeah, that's where I'm going.
Turn off the lights.
Martin, tell me when you're ready. I'll turn the lights on.
Okay, I'm ready. There we go. The last time I did this presentation, it took 90 minutes, and not a single person got up out of the room, and it was literally standing room only, so it was really fun. I had to abbreviate this down to 50 minutes, so I apologize for anything that's not being documented. And before we begin, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off, or vibrate if that's your kind of thing. Because if it rings during this presentation, you will be the most embarrassed person in the room. Have any questions, ask afterwards, provided we have the time. I'm going to try to go through this pretty fast. And to prevent this from being an hour-long infomercial, I wrote a book on the history of the shadow on radio, and that's the reason I'm up here doing this presentation. Since this is the 80th anniversary of the shadow, the Moot magazine, it seems fitting to explore the radio program that inspired and pretty much helped found the magazine. So without any further ado, lopsided table. You can because this is also interactive, don't pay attention to me, look on the screen. Some of these pictures are going to go pretty darn fast. You all familiar with the Shadow films you played this past weekend, last night, which had Blue Coal and the Shadow being featured on there? The program premiered on the evening of July 31, 1930, and it was called the Detective Story Magazine Hour. That is an advertisement from the New York Times promoting the series. Numerous reference guides out there have called it Detective Story Program and Detective Story Hour. The true title is Detective Story Magazine Hour. And the reason is because since they were trying to promote a magazine, they want the name of the program named after the product. That's why Eddie Cantor didn't have his own show. It was called the Texaco Town, because Texaco was the product. So this is one proof that, believe it or not, 15 reference books can be wrong. These advertisements, of course, do not make reference to the Shadow, and that's actually interesting because the character of the Shadow probably did not premiere until the 4th broadcast of the series. Most people say it was the premiere night. There has never been a review or any sort of documentation in newspapers to prove that the Shadow was on since the very first broadcast. So we know that he was in the 4th episode, which was August 21, 1930. The first 2 episodes were referred to as Detective Story Magazine Hour, and in newspapers it was called Detective Story, or Detective Program, or Mystery Program. On Washington Post, they referred to it as Tales of Mystery. And the reason for that is that newspapers could not print the full title of a program because it's considered sponsorship, and they want to pay for advertising space in the newspapers. So that's why the confusion of what the title exactly was. Who you see pictured up here with the CBS microphone is James Licurdo. He was the first person to play the role of the Shadow. This is a publicity photo from the CBS archives, which thankfully they still had. He played the role because he was part of the Judson Repertory Company, which was doing a lot of drama, and at that time it was not a commercial entity. Most of radio was offering was news commentary and music, with about an hour worth of drama, maybe 2 each night, and that was the maximum. So the earliest stages of the program was really experimental. Frank Reddick took over when James Licurdo had to leave for The Noble Experiment. It was a stage drama. He played Nick Medic. And the reason is that most of the actors on radio were supplementing income from doing Broadway and stage dramas. And obviously, if you're going to go on stage 6 nights a week, it's a lot more money than once a week on radio. So Frank Reddick came in and played the second Shadow. The magazine, Detective Story Magazine, you notice up here it says the magazine on the air. They actually tried to promote the radio program, hence promoting the issue. The band you see pictured on the front is the Shadow, at least one artist's conception of it, and it's actually probably the earliest conception sketch that we've been able to find. Because as you notice down here on the bottom left, there's a $1,000 Shadow contest. And every week on the radio program and in the magazine, they offered a clue as to what he would look like. They basically said that he would have hawk-like nose, which of course we saw in the illustrations and oil paintings later on the covers. So each week for about 7 or 8 weeks, they offered this contest. And this actually marks the earliest conception sketch of what they think the Shadow could look like. He was based actually on this man. It happens to be the Silver Massive Tenor. And he was, for many years, coming on to this program, sponsored by Lucky Strike, and kind of singing songs, and nobody knew who he was. The show was very popular because there was an awe of mystery. Who is the Silver Masked Tenor? Eventually it became public, but they thought the same thing would be great for the Shadow. So they did the same. No one knew in the newspapers who played the role of the Shadow, which helps make it a little bit difficult and more fun to dig up who it was. The solution was actually resolved, believe it or not, in September 25, 1931. This comes from the St. Louis newspaper archives from a library in St. Louis, which helped out. KMOX, KSD, and KWK in St. Louis, Missouri decided to broadcast this weekend the 7th Annual Southwest National Radio and Allied Products Exposition. It was broadcast out of the Crystal Coliseum. It was done twice a day for the 4 or 5 days. And on this particular Friday night, September 25, 1931, the Shadow actually unmasked. And that was when, after the first year of Detective Story Magazine Hour, that the Shadow was known who it was. It was Frank Reddick. He got up on stage. He was over there in St. Louis, took the mask off, and it became heralded news. Well, between the time the Detective Story Magazine Hour went off the air and Blue Coal Radio Review, which is when he made a return, they were not expecting the Shadow to come back at all, so it was no big deal. So when the Shadow did make a return to radio, they went back to the old press releases and said it remains a mystery. And of course, a couple of newspapers then began reporting, well, we suspect it's Frank Reddick. This is where the origin of that mystery surfaced. In January of 1932, Perfecto Light, automobile manufacturers of headlights, decided to bring the shadow back, and they signed up with CBS to do a program for about 8 weeks. Sadly, it lasted 5. Even though the shadow was still a narrator for creepy horror stories, the no-glare invention, which lit up highways, was deemed by the U.S. government as ineffective and had to be pulled off the market, which ended up causing Hochmeyer Lind Company, which manufactured Perfecto Light, to have to cancel their contract. And regrettably, CBS ended up losing some money on the deal, because if you can't have a sponsor, the show went off the air, and after 5 weeks, the shadow went off again. This time, but that marked the first time it was actually sponsored, because before that, it was Detective Story Magazine Hour, which was Street Smith Magazine. They did a lot of publicity all the way to Rocky Mountain time, which means it actually went all the way to close to the West Coast. This is an advertisement of the shadow, and he's actually a hooded monk, which was the earliest indications in some of the advertisements. There's an interesting little tidbit here. Do you notice it says on the Love Story Hour on the talking screen, which of course was those film shorts you saw last night, and in his own magazine. The Love Story Hour has become a big mystery for shadow buffs. And in simple solution, years ago, probably 20, 30 years ago, John Nanovic and Walter Gibson said that they recall the shadow being a host of the Love Story Magazine Hour. Nothing could be further from the truth. However, we uncovered some interesting tidbits of information, because that information was carried over into one encyclopedia, namely John Dunning's Tune In Yesterday, and then Walter Gibson had a shadow scrapbook. And because most authors consult previously published reference guides, and they don't actually dig into archives, they naturally assume that was a fact. And so book after book, magazine article after magazine article, it's been credited the shadow was the host of the Love Story Magazine Hour. Now let's put a little reality here, folks. Do you really think the shadow was the host of romance stories? Especially when you have David Ross as a poet coming up and reciting poems towards the end. And as you notice here in an early advertisement, the shadow was not mentioned as the host, because if he was that popular enough to come carry on to a romance program to promote the magazine, you would think they would have some images of the shadow on there. There is some interesting tidbits to dig up into this. First of all, the shadow was on the program, but only towards the end of the drama. He came on as a spokesman for his own magazine, which of course was very popular, but he would tell a tiny, brief little summary of a story that's appearing in the next magazine of, say, Detective Story Magazine, so it was a little bit of a highlight at the end. We found one script at the Library of Congress. We have it on PDF. It verifies that he was not the host, but he was a commercial spokesman at the end for his own magazine and for Detective Story Magazine. Therefore, myth has been debunked. Of course, there's a lot of myths that originate. In this old advertisement from 1944, it says right here in the middle that Nigel Bruce stars in The Shadow. I think that's supposed to be Nigel Bruce and Sherlock Holmes. Another myth that actually occurred is Kenny Delmar. In the 1980s, he appeared at the Friends of Old Time Radio, and he told a couple people that when Orson Welles was unable to make it to the studio to do The Shadow in the sometime during the time they were making the Goodrich transcription discs, he said he filled in for Orson Welles and said Orson was late coming to the set, so I had to fill in as Lamont Cranston in The Shadow. All the Goodrich transcription discs were surfaced recently. Terry Solensen of Audio Classics was approached by a woman whose father or grandfather apparently had all the discs, and so those lost episodes that have been coming out through Radio Spirits are now existing, and we verified that that was untrue. We don't think Kenny Delmar was lying, or at least telling a fib on purpose. What we really believe is that Kenny Delmar filled in for him during a rehearsal, and being 50 years later, memory doesn't serve exactly correctly, so the myth of him filling in for Orson Welles, well, kind of was, but not for the actual broadcast. Notice on the bottom right corner of some of these early Shadow Detective movies, even though they already have a description of what the Shadow looks like, they were still using the hooded monk that was often advertised on both the radio and spot ads and magazines. In this case, the Shadow Detective Monthly. This one's patterned after the James DeCurto actor who played the role. And in this one, an interesting that came in a radio guide was Detective Story Broadcast. And an actress, of course, is posing for the publicity photo, and there's another early version of the Shadow on radio. In June of 1930, in September of 1931, the Shadow returned on the Blue Coal Radio Review, and this premiered 4 weeks before the Love Story program. The Shadow, because of the Perfecto Lights broadcast were being canceled, they decided to take the character over to another program. For the Shadow to have actually appeared on Love Story magazine, Detective Hour, and the Blue Coal Radio Review, it's a little awkward to be 2 programs a week. So this was the series that he appeared, and we actually found a column in March 6, 1932, heralding that he was going to be appearing on this program as a regular, which verifies that he wasn't on 2 programs at the same time. Notice the product is Blue Coal Radio Review, another mention where this product, not the sponsor, is actually mentioned in the title of the program. In 1934-35, the Shadow came back on his own program called The Shadow, also sponsored by Blue Coal. And of all the incarnations, this one was done twice a week. You'll notice in the middle it says Monday and Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. on the Columbia networking stations. They actually had secret messages, and these were mentioned for people just to have decode and fun. You can find these in the Shadow magazine during this time period. It corresponds with the radio broadcast. Some of those catchphrases were carried over in 1937, 2 years later. The Orson Welles radio broadcast doesn't feature Wells in the opening. If you listen carefully, that's James Ricciardo in a recording doing the "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, and does the so shall ye reap evil." Those catchphrases, or "crime does not pay." They originated from the very same secret messages that were featured on this 1935 broadcast. So next time you listen to an Orson Welles broadcast, listen to the opening and closing. That's not Wells, that's James Ricciardo, provided by a recording. This is a sign that appeared on a trolley car. And I believe Dwight Furrow, who's here this weekend, helped supply this picture. Also, you notice it's twice a week, so we can figure out which season they were heavily promoting the program, so we can pinpoint an accurate year or years of when this was created. This one's one of my favorites. We got this off the eBay. Twice a week, the Shadow appears on radio. This is somebody dressed up like the Shadow. And they have right here the Shadow on a sign. They broadcast the radio tonight, WABC, 6:30 p.m., Blue Coal. And over here, you notice besides the Blue Coal product, it's actually the name of the company that sells it. Blue Coal was a company, but it was actually the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company. Blue Coal was the product. So whenever you read a book where it says that Blue Coal was a sponsor, in reality, it was not the sponsor, it was the product. Here's a company carrying their products, and they were heavily promoting it. We believe this was sometime around October 1935. This is Carl Cronkey. He played the role of the Shadow for McGregor and Sully. Before Orson Welles, there was a series of 26 episodes. They were 15 minutes apiece, all 2-parters. They were produced by a company in San Francisco called McGregor and Sully, and the transcription discs were sent across the country. Blue Coal, the product, actually had a territory. Their product was shipped as far west as Chicago, as far south as Richmond, Virginia, and all throughout the New England states. So when Blue Coal was the sponsor, the Shadow was not heard on most of the other parts of the country, because why would you want to pay for advertising on radio stations when your product isn't available? So this came as a solution. They did a series of Shadow broadcasts with the Shadow as a crime fighter, and that predates Orson Welles as a crime fighter, and it was broadcast in other areas of the country. Interesting enough, Street and Smith, which owned the rights to the Shadow, actually paid for sponsorship for some of those discs so that their magazines, such as down in Texas, could be promoted. If you look down here on the bottom left, the sponsor for this Flying A Oil, it says here, "Listen in, The Shadow, mystery drama broadcast every Tuesday and Thursday, 6 o'clock to 6:15. Since it's a 15-minute program, we know this was actually the McGregor and Sully transcriptions. This one was a little bit unique. This originates from about 1940, 1941. And what's interesting is you notice here it says, "Listen to The Shadow twice a week," and it starts at 5:15 p.m. A transcription disc was usually sent out to the stations, and the stations would sell local sponsorship. So somewhere in the Midwest, Royal Crown sponsored The Shadow, and this was the Carl Cronkey series. And this was done in 1940-41. This is actually during the time that Bill Johnstone had already taken over the role of The Shadow. Sadly, none of the recordings are known to exist, but copies of some of the labels do, so we believe the recordings are out there. It's just a matter of trying to find them. To herald the coming of Orson Welles playing the role of Shadow, in the Shadow magazine in early September, I believe this was September 1, 1937, they actually announced that the Shadow would return back to radio, and they wanted to hear your comments. The purpose was so that the editor would have, by the time the program premiered back on the air, some comments from people who were faithful radio listeners, so they could start heralding and publicizing, because to create any fictitious letters to the editor, that would be a little bit deceitful. Of course, we know who played the role, Orson Welles. Here's one for Mutual, W-O-R, and he actually is disguised as the Shadow. Agnes Moorehead played Margot Lane, inspired by the actress Margot Stevenson. Interesting enough, if you look at the radio scripts, Margot is spelled M-A-R-G-O-T. The T is silent. In the Pulps, it's M-A-R-G-O, which normally most people did not know until they check it. And Margot Stevenson's first name did have a T, and it was silent. During the month that she premiered as the Shadow, as the Margot Lane in the transcriptions, magazines owned by Street Smith decided to cross-promote, and so she appeared on the cover of Scribner's magazine and Mademoiselle. And interesting, even though she appeared on the front, nowhere in the magazine is there any reference that she is playing Margot Lane in the Shadow. So it must be considered poor advertising, because no one, unless they're Shadow fans, really understood why she was appearing on all these magazines all of a sudden. As we mentioned, Blue Coal was the product, and the name of the company was the Delaware Lackawanna Western Coal Company. The other main sponsor during the early years was Goodrich. This is an advertisement for the transcription discs. Like I mentioned of the McGregor and Sully, here they offer the program in two different collections, 13 or 26, because there was 26 episodes made. Blue Coal's contract was for 26 weeks, and to fill out the other 26, Goodrich helped out. Interesting enough, for the Orson Welles series, they were completely different adventures, but unless Blue Coal approved of those episodes being broadcast in their territory, the Goodrich episodes were not aired. So in other words, one section of the country could hear Blue Coal sponsoring The Shadow, but 26 completely different adventures were being broadcast on another area of the country with a different sponsor. So for anyone who heard all 52, they had to be in the right listening area and be lucky at that time. This is an advertisement sent out to the Goodrich dealers. The method was, and here's another advertisement, the method was that the Goodrich dealers were given an opportunity to pay for the discs and then have them broadcast over their local stations. And so, this is why you would see Thornton's Tire Service, because they sold the product. Just like you saw the Blue Coal Parade with the actual name of the company that was carrying the Blue Coal product, this one actually carried, even though it was the famous Thornton Super Tread, Goodrich tires apparently as well. And they decided to broadcast. Some of the dealers ganged up together and paid for the discs to have their company promoted. The local spots, if you've ever heard any of those Goodrich episodes of The Shadow, you'll notice that towards the end there's a good 2 or 3 minutes of nothing but music. That was for the local announcer to actually get up and pitch the Goodrich recordings, the Goodrich tires. And they would also mention where and the name of all the local dealers. Instead of saying contact your local dealer, they actually made specifically that mention. So the discs we hear are the transcriptions, but of course that lacks the announcer because that was done live at the time. This is an interesting advertisement that promotes Goodrich Safety Silvertown tires. WFBL, keep your dial at 1380, entertaining programs. And up here, you can see The Shadow being promoted as a window display. Goodrich, of course, wasn't the only sponsor. Across the country, transcription discs were being made, and I'll get into that in a minute as to who was responsible. But across the country, around 1947-48, there was about 75 different sponsors across the country. So if someone says, well, I remember The Shadow was sponsored by Kellogg's Pep, they may have been right, as much as we might say, well, no, I've never heard of that. It depends on what part of the country. Here on the East Coast, here on the West Coast, in this advertisement, Canada Dry. Kohler's Dry Cleaners and Launderers actually promoted the program, and here it says, tune in The Shadow, the mystery thriller. Of course, World War II, you also notice it says buy defense bonds. Carnation Ice Cream sponsored it in one part of the country. So did Dunlap Roofing and Flooring Company, and that is Grace Matthews at the top left. This one I kind of enjoy. Bill says for thrills and chills, hear the shadow. So if Bill says it, it must be right. Lustig's. And Lustig's has an interesting story. Lustig's shoe store was in Youngstown, Ohio, right here in the state. And the manager was named Sid Klein. And Sid Klein, believe it or not, was known by all the kids in the local town as being the shadow himself, because for some reason he wasn't around during the half hour that the program aired. So not to disillusion the kids, he made sure he was unavailable for a half hour every week when the show was broadcast. Notice Ed Cartier's advertised artwork from the Pulps was actually carried over into some of the Pulps, into the advertisements. This one's in Iowa. This one was sponsored by Powerhouse Candy Bar. They were a big name. They even sponsored the Shadow in Detroit, which has an interesting story because George W. Trendle, who was basically responsible for the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet, Sergeant Preston and the Yukon, also had a program called Ned Jordan's Secret Agent. And on March 18, 1941, there was an episode called Signals on the Sea. And Judy Medwick, his secretary, went up to Ned Jordan and said, "Hey, I like your shadow glow-in-the-dark ring. Ned, where did you get it?" And he briefly tells her. Well, this, of course, floors us. This is a completely different production. What the heck? The shadow's being publicized on a Ned Jordan Secret Agent episode? Turns out Ned Jordan was also sponsored by Powerhouse Candy Bar. And there's your connection. There's another advertisement for Powerhouse Candy Bar. This one I like. Captain Easy is down at the bottom right in Hastings, Nebraska. This is an amateurish advertisement, which was actually illegal. There were certain rules and policies you were to adhere to when you were carrying transcription discs, because the owners, in this case Street Smith, owned the character of the Shadow, and they did not want the Shadow being portrayed in the wrong light. Somehow this slipped past them and was shown in a local newspaper in Hastings, Nebraska. This one I like. The Shadow's endorsing cigarette smoking. The West Durham Lumber Company. The man responsible for the transcription disc was Charles Michelson. He was a pioneer in helping to establish syndications, and he had a large number of programs. This advertisement comes from Radio Daily, and mainly because the only people who read Radio Daily is not the regular general public, but actually the radio station managers who look at the ad and they contact them and say, well, we have somebody in the local area who might want to sponsor one of these programs. How do we get the disc? What's the price? Notice that on the ad and any future ads I show you, there's no pricing. It's all dependent on how large or how many wattage your radio station provided, how many listeners you had, how much the sponsor, in some cases, was going to pay because they wanted a percentage of that. Charles Michelson made a fortune. In fact, because of these recordings is why we have most of the Shadow recordings today. Here you notice he has the adventures of Dick Cole, Blackstone the Magic Detective, The Avenger. Up here, top left, obviously the first one you want to be seeing, is his big cash cow, the Shadow. Michelson approached in early 1938 Street Smith and said, look, if you're going to have these transcribed, how about you have them broadcast in areas where blue coal and Goodrich isn't really necessarily easily accessible, and I will give you a kickback. And of course they agreed. In this advertisement, and another same periodical, they have The Avenger, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It was the series that Walter Gibson wrote the scripts for. It's a very big, bland rip-off of The Shadow. But only 26 episodes was ever recorded and broadcast. Notice they're promoting 52. Originally, they were going to do 52. Apparently, they couldn't sell enough transcription discs to enough stations to make it justifiable to record another additional 26. The Shadow here says 300 programs. That's another bit of a stretch of the truth because they hadn't even broadcast 300 episodes by the time this was aired. But if a station says we want to broadcast a show once a week, how long is it really going to take for them to catch up to the number of figures, considering the show's still being broadcast live? So every time it was broadcast with Blue Call, Michelson's office in New York would record the episodes and then put them on transcription discs without the Blue Call commercials, and then the discs would be sent out to radio stations. In this case, The Creeper, an early 1940s episode, and they numbered them, etc. This radio station, KGFN, decided to initial to keep track of which ones they broadcast and which ones they didn't, because they were broadcast not necessarily in sequential order. And they put a date of August 1, 1947. That was their way of keeping track. Michelson originated from New York. This one I like. It actually has Ed Cartier's artwork, and this is a label that was never used. So you actually get to see what it looks like without any handwritten episode numbers, and so on and so forth. Because of that, sometimes the actors who played the Shadow, which interchanged, would be all over the country. You could be in Honolulu, and one week you hear Brett Morrison playing the role. The next week it could be Bill Johnstone, because they were transcription discs and they were just sent at random. Next week you have Bill Johnstone again with, say, Grace Matthews. Next week, Bill Johnstone again. And then just throw the mix in, Orson Welles might take over the part for the next week. Apparently, if you weren't listening to him live at the time on the East Coast, you could be listening to whoever it was week by week. It's because of the Michelson that we have all the recordings. Because, believe it or not, beginning with the 1944-45 season, Michelson said we have 263 episodes. That's more than we could ever syndicate on any local station, because no one's broadcasting these shows 5 days a week. So he stopped recording them beginning in the fall of 1944, which is why, if you look at all the dates on the pre-existing episodes, that's why beginning in fall of 1944, there's barely any recordings surviving. It's because of that. Of course, World War II gets into play, and this is the closed caption, "Reporting for duty, sir." You have the Lone Ranger, the Shadow, and Superman, all three radio personalities. And they also performed the Shadow on a couple of occasions for the troops overseas. Since the Shadow also crossed over into a radio quiz program called Quick as a Flash, which was a detective program in which the guests were able to try to figure out who the murderer was and what was the solution to get a prize money, sometimes they did them on tour. This is actually John Archer playing the role of the Shadow for a bunch of troops during World War II. John Archer, incidentally, while he only did one season of the Shadow, is the only actor to be distinctively remembered for playing the role of the Shadow by coming from Hollywood. He was already a screen actor. Everyone else originated from the stage, then went Hollywood after the Shadow. During World War II, of course, the Shadow appeared in comic books as well. Very big publicity. This picture of this magazine, believe it or not, originates from Rick Payne, who's probably in the audience here. He's a vendor downstairs, and he has this very same issue up on the wall on display. So if you were interested in picking this up, I would check with him. Shadow Comics also has interesting adaptations of some of the radio scripts, such as The Leopard Man, which was dealing with the leopard cult. There was also matchbooks, which obviously, if you're selling blue coal, it's a nice, cute gimmick to get people to listen to your radio program. It's called Product Loyalty. And on one occasion, for one Shadow broadcast in particular in 1945, they decided to give away free matchbooks to anyone who wrote in. This was to gauge the listenership and encourage product loyalty, because all the Nielsen's and all those ratings back then were not reliable, unless they actually had someone standing by the phone and calling randomly 2,000 people to find out what they're listening to get a percentage base of who was listening to the radio programs. It wasn't possible. So generally, whenever you hear a giveaway on a kids program like Sky King, Hop Harrigan, Lone Ranger, it was really designed to gauge how many listeners and to convince the sponsors that there was plenty of them out there. So that's how they purchased it. Inside the books, of course, they list the major cities and where they can listen to the Shadow. Notice there was 4 o'clock, 4:30, and 5:30. 5:30 and 40:30 obviously is East Coast and Central Time. The 4 o'clock is a little unusual. Schenectady actually broadcast the program by delay, and Rochester did too. They would record that Sunday's broadcast and air it the very next Sunday. So while you can see a broadcast date for an episode, say September 13, that episode may have aired on September 20th, which means certain parts of the country was airing it 1 week delayed. Later sponsors were done a little differently. Charles Michelson said, "I think I can do a setup for you." Street Smith said, "Obviously this would be great money." To save money on discs, he found large areas. In this case, it was Bombard. That was the product. And they were able to actually broadcast the series with their commercials. Another one was Carrie Salt. And for about 4 years, maybe 5, all 3 sponsors were the 3 primary sponsors. There was a total of 208 stations. And divide that up with, say, 120 for Blue Call, 75 for Carrie Salt, etc. To do this live was a little bit tricky. So what Charles Michelson did is he had 3 different sound booths, 3 different announcers, and I'll show you a picture of Brett Morrison in the sound booth in a minute so you get an idea, to do the sponsors. So when the commercial time came up, what happened was the announcer would come in for Blue Call, On other connections, they would dim down the sound, and they would actually have a local sponsor and another sound booth deliver the Carrie Salt commercials. So all three were being done about the same time. This advertisement never appeared in newspapers. I shouldn't say never. The radio station and the time is left blank. That was usually filled in by, say, in this case, Carrie Salt, who would send it to the local newspapers, and it would be replaced. So if you see newspapers with obviously the radio stations and the time, this is what it looks like before it was submitted to the radio stations. Carrie Salt was very instrumental in trying to promote the Shadow program. This is a telegram that came from the daughter whose father actually won a wristwatch, Samuel Parker, of all people. They had a contest for a $100 17-jewel Harman Gold wristwatch. If you write in and tell them why you like the Shadow. They sent a telegram to her father and then an official letter, December 10, 1946, and she still has the watch to this day. This is a sound booth. This is what the announcers would be in separate. So if they have three different announcement booths, each announcer could do a different sponsor. Brett Morrison here is playing the role of the Shadow. For the amusement of the radio audience, it was done in a theater. And so sometimes during the Shadow broadcast, if you listen carefully, you'll hear somebody cough in the background. Sometimes or sneeze or laugh. It's because it's done before a live studio audience. They had two rules. One, you were not allowed to bring babies in because babies might cry during the broadcast. Second, you were allowed to applause and not applause when they lift the signs up. To create the illusion of the Shadow, whenever he was there, the actor would go into a sound booth, hidden away so the audience would never see the Shadow or an actor playing the role. Regrettably, times were different back then. They assumed that Margot Lane and Lamont Cranston, while not married, might have had a little romantic fling during the show, which clearly they were, because she was her faithful companion. When Grace Matthews was pregnant, the last few broadcasts, I believe it was 1948, she was on stage. They had to take the program into a separate studio and not on stage because they were afraid the audience might misinterpret that Margot Lane and Lamont Cranston were having an illicit affair and she was pregnant. During the 50s, the program did a major change. After Blue Coal stopped around 49, companies like Wild Blue Cream Oil, apparently it picks up chicks, will actually was a sponsor for a short while. So was, ironically, Sylvania TV, because they were promoting the television set on radio, which makes sense if you're not watching TV, why would you want to? Advertisements went across the country, tons of them, and they were all different ones. This one's for WNAC. The later episodes in the 50s, however, had some different changes. More importantly, because of the communist era, instead of battling Nazis and Japanese agents and just Gestapo mad scientists, the Shadow decided to battle communists, but in a different light. A man by the U.S. government named David Fairfield came into the program. He was a recurring character who were going off for about 2 years. And David Fairfield actually recruited Lamont Cranston as a secret agent to help spy and go behind the Iron Curtain and leak information. Somehow Fairfield wasn't aware that Lamont Cranston was also the Shadow, and he was able to foil the espionage schemes. Because of that, less mad scientists, less mad monsters and werewolves and vampires were featured on the program for a while. Another character was Lieutenant Steele, who replaced Commissioner Weston on occasion. And Lieutenant Steele was a recurring character who basically played the same role, except his final episode on the series in which his son was accused of a crime, and it turned out his son really did commit the crime. And it was basically a special civic service program in which emphasizing juvenile delinquency was inappropriate. So here you had the main character's son being tried for a crime he did commit. Later episodes, of course, you see Wild Blue Cream Oil. These appear in other Street and Smith periodicals, Astounding Science Fiction, Air Trails, all those magazines. You can find these advertisements promoting the series. More amusing, some of the scriptwriters like Max Ehrlich, John Robert, and Judith Bublick were writing not just for The Shadow, but for other crime programs such as Nick Carter, Master Detective. There's a few scripts that were not only done on The Shadow, but then they changed the name of the character, got rid of the invisible part, and they reused them for Nick Carter, and in some cases vice versa. In fact, one episode of The Shadow does not have the Shadow becoming invisible. He hides behind a door and Lamont Cranston catches him, just as it was done on Nick Carter 2 years before. Some of the scripts were also reused on Suspense. They actually used an episode that exists today in recorded form called the Kettler Method. from 1942. The year before, the same script was done on The Shadow, called Nightmare at Galesbury. And of course, on the Suspense, they don't use the Shadow; they use a different fictitious name. He does not become invisible. But the scriptwriters, running out of stories, were reusing them week after week on other programs. In some cases, like this particular one, The Buffalo Courier, was broadcast on November 28, 1954. It's considered one of the hundreds of lost episodes. It does not exist. Sadly, the Library of Congress and Street Smith does not have a copy of the script. So the only way we know what was even broadcast on that night is this one advertisement in the Buffalo Courier where they call it Murder in the Museum. And regrettably, because of lack of preservation, that's all we know about this particular episode. In Australia, The Shadow made a crossover with, of course, New York becoming Brisbane or New South Wales and so on. They changed the names of certain localities, and the Vacuum Oil Company was broadcasting The Shadow. There was originally a run from 1946 to 47. It ran 78 episodes, and it featured, in this case, Lloyd Lamble. He played the role of Lamont Cranston. And when he left, Lloyd Barrow. He played the role. Many of these episodes are known to exist in recorded form. They're not very good production values compared to the American series. But what's interesting is that we just recently discovered about a year ago there was a whole nother run of The Shadow done in 1940 in Australia. And we know at least 4 episodes were recorded. We don't know if they were broadcast because we're still digging into that, but 2 episodes surfaced. And it has a completely different cast. So it seems besides South America and Mexico and Australia, there's other renditions of The Shadow, and in many cases, such as this, more than one different run. In this case, in Australia, they also did Nick Carter. If you're going to do The Shadow, it's owned by the same copyright owners. It makes sense to license the other property. In the 1970s, there was a resurgence. Because Charles Michelson did all those syndicated radio programs on the discs, he pulled them out of his archive and then began making them available in the 60s during the nostalgic boom. And beginning in 1964, local radio stations began broadcasting The Shadow, which a lot of people probably remember hearing on their radio stations when they're going to and from work. To this day, there is still broadcast, even on the internet radio stations. In the 1970s, they tried to spoof this one with Taster's Choice for The Shadow Knows. And throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, many of the actors appeared on conventions, like in this case, the Friends of Old Time Radio. This one was done sometime in the 1980s, working from left to right. That's Alice Reinhardt, who appeared as a supporting cast member on a number of episodes, as well as Evie Juster. On the right, that's Grace Matthews. She played the role of Margot Lane sometime around the mid-1940s, all the way until 1954. And they enjoyed a long, healthy run doing recreations on stage, etc. It looks like I actually did manage to succeed in doing this in a 40-minute time frame, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'll be more than glad to answer. I got a question right there.
Did you say that it was Jane Ricardo recorded
I'm sorry, Frank Reddick.
Okay.
My fault. A little bit of dyslexia in me, yes. Frank Reddick did the voice. Interesting, 1941 they did a Shadow episode called The Shadow Challenged, in which there's a duplicate Shadow, an evil one, and he's... listen carefully, that's Frank Reddick as the arch nemesis, the alter ego Shadow, which is a brilliant stroke of casting. Not that I know of. Those early broadcasts were not only done live, but probably the reason it was never recorded, those early ones, is because it cost a lot of money. And unless it was under contract for the sponsors or the network or for legal reasons, no one wanted to spend the money. In 1939 alone, 9 years after The Shadow premiered on radio, it cost $90 for an episode. That was $90 back then to have an episode transcribed. So we have to really be lucky somebody had the foresight or for legal reasons recorded a particular episode.
Do you know how long it was in the role and when
We know the exact dates. I didn't write them down. I know it's in the book. You need to plug that. Curto played it for a short while, for a few months. Then he left for the Noble Experiment. Frank Reddick came in. And a lot of people say, well, Curto wasn't well accepted by his voice, but I think it was because of the stage play. It's timely, literally by the date. Frank Reddick was on for a while, took sick, Curto came back and filled in for him, and then Frank Reddick came back. So it zigzags back and forth as you're playing the role of the Shadow. It also is possible some third party who might have filled in or somebody might have done a few weeks and we're just not aware of it since the recordings don't exist.
What was the total number of radio plays done, and what percentage still exists? Also, when was the last one done?
The last one was done in December of 1954. There was just a hair over 700 episodes. We're talking the continuities, beginning with Orson Welles all the way up to 54. Before that, the pre-continuities, we're talking a couple hundred. None of the pre-continuities are known to exist. The continuities is about 260 to 280, given on the tape what's out in circulation, what's still in archives. That's about 1/3 of 700 that are known to exist. Beginning in 1950, when Blue Coal ceased sponsoring The Shadow, Mutual decided to do it on tape. So they would record the episodes, say, on a Wednesday when it was more convenient for the actors. Then they would actually broadcast them on Sunday afternoon. Mutual, being cheap, and they have a track record of doing that, they recorded over the same tapes week after week. So the fact we even have 2.5 episodes post-dating 1950 is actually remarkable.
Did they still record back then?
Yeah, they sold a couple here and there, but it really was a rights issues. Michelson had all their masters. So what we have, most of what we have, I'd say 98%, is because of Michelson saving the recordings. Interesting, in the 60s, he couldn't cover the music rights because Rosario and Elsie Thompson were doing the organ music. So he dubbed it in with orchestral pieces, which of course just cuts in and cuts out, it doesn't fade in. You probably will hear one or two of them in recordings out there, that's a Michelson. To my knowledge, most of them now are out there uncut without those horrible orchestral 60s music scores. I think the Green Man, which I know exists, is probably the only one that's not out in circulation with the original organ music. That's how you can tell the difference between the two. But if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have as many shadow recordings today. I saw a couple other hands back there.
Yeah, were these discs required to be returned to Street and Smith, or were they actually, when you bought them, you own them and you could do whatever you want with them?
The stations bought their recordings, or sponsors in the case of Goodrich. They were required to return the discs. There was usually a very meticulous checklist. They made sure that all the discs were returned appropriate. On rare occasions, a mistake would happen if they were mislabeled. In one case in Oklahoma, they played the first half of one episode, and when they basically did the local announcer, and they played the other half of another disc, it was the wrong episode, and radio listeners were confused as to what happened to the story. They were supposed to be returned, only now we hope that some other people did not. In the case of the Goodrich transcriptions that surfaced a few years ago, the woman whose grandfather was involved with that, he actually was a Goodrich tire dealer, enjoyed the recording, and somehow they just never got returned, and he saved them all those years. So there can truly be a deposit still up in someone's attic from some other recordings. I saw a couple other hands. Oh, hands went down. Okay. Well, looks like I ended just a couple minutes early because somebody's supposed to start, I believe, in a few minutes. So thank you very much. If you have any questions,